Hi friends, thanks for joining me. On today's adventure, we're headed to central South Dakota, actually headed back. If you're a frequent flyer, you may have seen Brandon Drury's get his first ever pheasant out in South Dakota, after a little bit of effort, I might add. Still, this trip was essentially a deer hunting trip. We were going there to try and put together a plan to harvest whitetail and or mule deer in open country with archery equipment. Now, this part of South Dakota is, like I said, best known for its abundant pheasant population, but in my opinion, it is also a real sleeper for outsized whitetail and access to quality mule deer without having to go all the way to the Rocky Mountains. We did do some pheasant hunting each day, like I said. Brandon actually did get his first bird on this trip. There, you got him! Good shot, man! These were obviously some fast flying and wild birds, a tough target especially for a beginner, and I was beginning to think I was going to have the same problem on the deer hunt. Lots of open ground, lots of wind to deal with, and very, very few trees or ambush points. All of the sign did show that there were good bucks here. We saw rubs and scrapes everywhere. All I needed to do now was devise a plan that would put me in front of one of them big boys standing in the wide open. Hey, I'm your host, Kyle Randall. This is my Wilderness Journal, and we're headed out on the big prairie looking for a big buck right now. We enjoyed the last of the night singers, and then it started to get light out, and when it did, we could look around. All along the creek bank, we could see mature oak trees. Unfortunately, I already knew most of the acorns were gone, but I really wasn't that concerned. These were some of the biggest trees that we saw and were easy enough to get up and put a stand in, and on top of that, while we were walking through the shelter belts just above this valley, we found all manner of scrapes and rubs, all kind of deer sign. Unfortunately, after sitting there for 4 hours, we hadn't seen a single deer. With the acorns gone, nothing came to visit my mock scrape. My scents didn't entice anything. The deer had obviously moved closer to the crop fields, and we needed to do the same. I saw a lot of buck sign in that creek bottom. Unfortunately, we didn't see any deer. All of the acorns were gone, and with them, it appeared, most of the deer activity. We needed to move closer to the fields. We searched and found a shelter belt that backed up against a giant cornfield and had at least semi-mature trees. Threw up a stand, and the next morning, Brandon and I were sitting in a rather smallish tree waiting on daylight. This particular tree was set right dead center in the middle of one of the oldest shelter belts we could find. It actually had trees sort of big enough to get into. And more importantly, we'd seen a lot of deer sign here too. There's definitely some pheasants out there. There was a big cornfield behind us, some cut milo and sunflowers out in front of us. This was what I had hoped to find. Now all I needed was some deer. And then, about 10 minutes after my last grunting session, I swore I heard something grunting back at me right behind us. I looked and I looked. I couldn't see nothing, but I know what I heard. And then I saw him. There was a small buck, almost invisible in the high grass right behind us, about 25-30 yards. Definitely not a shooter, but he had snuck all the way in there, and if he hadn't grunted back at me, I don't think I'd even known he was there. We sat watching as he tried to find us, and I have to apologize for the shaking. The tree we were in was so small that every time Brandon or I shifted our weight, it would wobble. Friends, when I tell you there aren't a lot of trees out here, I mean there aren't a lot of trees. I was kind of feeling lucky to find this one. We watched as he circled all the way around us, fortunately without catching our wind. And then he started working down through the shelter belt. He was headed for a scrape. I watched him work it. And then he turned and came back and started working another scrape. This was obviously a scrape line. And friends, you have to know if you hunt whitetails, where one young buck will come and work a scrape line, so too will older deer. It's just a matter of time. Brandon and I sat there watching this little guy circle back and forth, just laughing to ourselves. He would come and then turn and go back. I had a decoy out, and I'm certain that's what was holding his attention, but he would work all the way up next to us and then back out in front of the tree. I didn't want to spook him, obviously. There might be another buck standing over there in the brush watching him. You never know. You just want to be cool and watch the show. We were just sitting there enjoying the moment, but we were also going to school. I noticed, for instance, that every time this little buck walked out in front of us, he stopped and sniffed one particular little piece of brush, one little stick. It really seemed to fascinate him, and I had no idea how important that one little stick would be until days later. But I did know that paying attention to those little things can sometimes make all the difference, especially in an archery hunt. We were definitely learning, but we were definitely laughing too. When he worked all the way out again and then turned and worked all the way back in and then came right up under us, I mean right under my feet. If I'd have had a rock, I could have dropped it on his head, and he had no idea, no clue we were there. That's the value of scent control. That's the value of a quality stand placement. It's a little bit of luck, but it's also a lot of hard work and experience, and if you're going to hunt open country deer especially, you better go prepared for all of that. At 6 or 8 feet straight down, it was a lot of fun to watch this guy. He was testing the wind. He'd look over and stare at that decoy. He would scent check every little stick, piece of grass. And the important part of this is he never found us. He finally gave up, worked his way back around straight downwind of our tree, actually stood there nibbling on some leaves for a few minutes, and then finally he wandered off. Is that close enough for you? He never did pull in a bigger buck, but I can't say that I didn't enjoy that morning in the tree stand. That little guy made it worth the sit all by himself. That youngster may not have been a shooter yet, but but it certainly gave me confidence we had made the right move. In fact, that evening we sat watching as a doe worked her way in toward us through the field, and even though she was flushing pheasants with just about every step, I knew that if she was coming through there, bucks would be coming as well. That scrape line, the one that little buck was working, that was definitely the place to set up. Now all we needed was a little luck and a little more time. We sat in the gathering light, listening to the night shift go and the day shift come on. We were back in that exact same tree, watching that exact same scrape line. We could hear pheasants flying off the roost, and afterward I started doing a little grunting. And probably 15 minutes later, another buck was working his way up the shelter belt. This deer was obviously larger than the buck from yesterday. He had what looked like a basic 8-point rack. Some of his tines were busted off, but he was definitely heavier and older, probably a 2.5-year-old. But either way, he was working the exact same scrapes that deer had worked the day before. It was proven that more than one buck would work the same scrape line, and who knows, there might be an even bigger buck following this one. All we could do now was sit and watch like we'd done the day before. Maybe this would be the decoy that pulled in the big one. Unlike the buck from the day before, this guy worked a couple of scrapes and then went straight out through the salt cedars heading south, only to reappear right out in front of us, working his way back in. Like the buck from the day before, he just stood there staring at that decoy. He was only 35 yards out, right there in front of us, but he just stood there, staring, watching. Had I wanted to take a shot, I certainly could have had all the time in the world to do it. I was just hoping that his presence, him being there, would drag an older deer in, and then finally, he started to move. I grunted at him a little bit. I really didn't want him to leave. And then he surprised me by walking right over to that same little stick that the buck had licked the day before. Now that's important only because it was sitting right in the middle of one of my shooting lanes, and if a bigger buck did come in, I had every reason to believe he would head right there and give me a quality shot at 31 yards. That kind of information, like I said earlier, may seem like a small thing, but trust me, friends, it can make all the difference. The buck worked his way into within 20-25 yards and stood there staring again, only now you could tell he was getting nervous. He kept looking and then he bolted. He snorted, took a couple of bounds, turned and looked back. I couldn't believe that he was getting that worked up over that decoy. He'd been staring at it for 20 minutes. But whatever it was that had him bothered, he definitely was on high alert. He would take a couple of bounds, throw his tail up, then turn, face us, stare, look off behind us, stare, stomp his feet, snort, stare. Something, and I was pretty sure it wasn't us, had this buck really worked up. I kept looking behind us over toward the decoy. I couldn't see anything, but he certainly saw something he didn't like. And then I turned and looked one more time, and there was a coyote. A coyote had worked its way down along the cornfield and was sitting over there staring at the decoy from the other side.
You camera guys. What are you calling coyotes in the middle of a deer hunt for? Who called the coyote? Was that you? No, I think that was you. Camera guys, man.
Despite that coyote spooking that 8-point, which really wasn't a shooter anyway, we did get some valuable information that morning. More than one buck was using that scrape line, and it was just a matter of time before a big boy moved in and laid claim to it. Unfortunately, the forecast for the morrow was 30 to 50 mile-an-hour winds, and there was no way Brandon and I were going to stay in one small tree, not in those conditions. We decided rather than sit in the lodge, though, to head up to the riverbanks, try to find some spots out of the wind and maybe stalk a mule deer. And despite getting buffeted all over the place by that wind, we did find some muleys, a doe and a fawn bedded down in a draw, a small buck on the lee of a hillside. Unfortunately, there was no way I could even hold a bow upright, let alone shoot it in those conditions. There were obviously deer here too, but with that much wind, I would have had to shoot my bow tomorrow to get an arrow across one of those draws and hit a deer yesterday. Yeah, it was just too windy. There was no hope of getting a decent shot, so we headed back to the lodge. And the following afternoon, I actually did take a few minutes to go out and try some of that pheasant hunting. I grabbed my 410 and we headed out, and I have to tell you, if you go out that way, you gotta try this. Our plan was to do the same as we had done with Brandon, work our way out through the shelter belts to the edge of the field, and then hopefully...
Rooster!
Got him. Touch him down.
Oh, there he is.
All right, cool. Oh, yeah. See if you can go as far as I thought. Unload this blunderbuss, this ground howitzer. Isn't that awesome? That's a full load right there, buddy. I come fully loaded. Look under here. That's not so bad. Yes, sir. That's what we was looking for right there. Look at that, mister. That's what we call speed chicken. Awesome. Oh, come here, you. Tuck him in the back here. We're digging it. I'd managed to hit the very first one, and not 5 minutes later... Yeah? It was definitely time to quit while I was still ahead. That's how that's supposed to work. Right there. Nice old rooster. Look at how pretty them are. I tell you, that is part of the deal. South Dakota, wild pheasants. They're not them big, clunky pen raised jobs. These are a little tougher, as Brandon there will attest, but they are doable, and they're even doable with the big gun. You know what I mean? The 410, that's a lot more numbers than 12, right? That is a beautiful, beautiful pheasant. The bird hunting was fantastic. Unfortunately, our time in South Dakota was coming to an end. In fact, tomorrow would be our last day in camp, so I decided we were going to go back to that scrape line and give it one last chance. Sometimes the last day is the best day, and trust me when I tell you, I'm not opposed to a little of that last day magic. I'll take all the help I can get. Just after daylight, I noticed we weren't the only hunters out there on the shelter belt, so I decided, I'm going to try a little rattling. Maybe I can bring in a buck. and I was just about done with my first session when I thought I saw a deer standing out in the weeds. And then I was sure of it. And it wasn't just a deer, it was the deer. Here was a smoker of a buck standing out there listening, looking.
He's at his ears. He's at his ears.
He seemed interested, but he really wasn't coming. He just sort of hovered out there. This was obviously a shooter, but he'd have to come another 50, 60 yards closer before I'd have any hope of getting a shot.
Hold that, please.
He looked back each time I grunted, but in the end, yeah, he just walked off right on out of my life. He never did give me a chance. Close, just not close enough. I just couldn't entice that big boy to come another 40 or so yards, get him in my wheelhouse. Who knows, maybe with another day or two, and then again, maybe not. It's like that. It's archery hunting. Still, I left South Dakota making plans to go back, and I know Brandon's going back. He says he's got a score to settle with a few dozen pheasants, and I can't say that I blame him. It is a great place to pheasant hunt. They have some tremendous deer, and it's truly underhunted, something you can't say about very many places in this day and age. And I truly believe if you're up for a challenge, if you're interested in something different, you might want to try it yourself. Just make sure you practice at 30 or 40 yards with your bow. Take a good pair of burr-proof breeches, some extra shotgun shells, and your hiking boots. Friends, I hope we see you out there because it truly is a great time and a great multi-opportunity trip. And who knows, if we do, well, we might stop and share that cup and a fire, certainly give you some extra shotgun shells. And if I don't see you out there, well, then I'll wait for you right back here so we can share another adventure from my Wilderness Journal.